Okay, so thank you very much, Cristiano, for agreeing to present. Cristiano is a labor economist working on a lot of papers on inequality, I saw. But today you're going to tell us why there has been long-term wage stagnation in Japan over many decades. So just before you start talking, just a reminder to everybody that the seminar is being recorded and it will be available on the GLO website at some point next week, hopefully. And also, please mute your microphones during the seminar, but feel free to unmute if you have any questions. Over to you, Cristiano.
Thank you. Thank you and welcome. Thank you for joining this seminar. The title is No Standard Employment and Rent Sharing, and this is a joint work with Kyoji Fukao from Ito Tsubashi University in Tokyo and Fabrizio Pompei, also from the University of Perugia. And the paper is forthcoming in Economica. We received the good news about 10 days ago, and so after a long way, we managed to get it through. So a few words about how our motivations. So basically, lack of inclusivity of economic growth has raised a number of concerns, and this has basically redirected attention, a lot of attention on the dynamics of labor incomes. Just let's only, for example, think about labor income shares and so on. And one interesting strand of this literature is focused on rent sharing, which is a very interesting channel related also to income inequality, because it affects directly functional income distribution, so the division of rents between capital and labor, but also when there is heterogeneity in rent sharing across sectors or across firms, it also affects wage inequality because workers earn different wages. So through wage inequality, it also affects personal income distribution and household income distribution. And there is, in fact, some evidence existing, quite extensive, that rent sharing is heterogeneous across sectors and across firms, and also has changed, the pattern has changed significantly over time. Surprisingly, this topic has received little attention in Japan, only in some comparative studies. And this is surprising because this might be one of the explanations of the sluggish economic growth and the stagnation of wages that has been at the core of the debate on the Japanese labor market and Japanese economy in the last 2 or 3 decades. So what we do in this paper is we take the model by Estevao and Tevlin on rent sharing, and we try to develop it modeling a duality that emerged in the last decades on the Japanese labor market related to regular and non-regular employment. Regular employment in Japan is basically full-time permanent employment. Non-regular employment is the rest of the labor market. So we want to look at the effect of rent sharing on wages of regular employment, and also to look at whether the increase in non-regular workers, in the share of non-regular workers, is affecting wages of regular workers. Because so far, Kawaguchi and Mori, for example, in 2019, highlighted how this effect might be mainly a compositional effect. So since wages of non-regular workers are on average much lower than for regular workers, this is flattening the wage curve on average. But what we claim and our conjecture is that when the share of non-regular workers increases, this is weakening the rent sharing of regular workers too. And we look at industry level data using a very rich data set that you might know, Japan Industrial Productivity, JIP database. and the data are for over 4 decades, but I will go back to that. So some stylized facts. Here is something that is probably well known to all of you, starting from the 90s. These are United States, UK, and Germany, and in red, with red frame, Japan. And you see that wages more or less increased in all countries, and so did productivity, but not in Japan, where labor productivity grew to a much lesser extent, and wages basically did not grow. So we have observed a well-known divergence of productivity and wages. Concomitantly, so starting from the 90s, a strong duality, as I mentioned, emerged between regular and non-regular employment, and you can see it clearly from this diagram on the right, in which around the 90s there was a sharp increase in the share of non-regular employment, especially in some sectors. So these box plots are illustrating the distribution of sectors by the share of regular employment, 85 sectors. So some of them reached very high levels. And here the diagram is excluding outliers, because there are some sectors in which 80% of employment of hours worked are worked by non-regular workers. So what happened around the 90s? Collapse of the bubble economy, increasing competition by Asian countries' competitors, and all this led to the crisis of the specific employment system, Japanese employment system based on the idea of lifetime employment. This was the policy response was labor market deregulation in order to increase flexibility of companies and also reduce labor costs, because of course a system that is strongly based on seniority and within the firm is also increasing labor costs for older workers. And on the side of labor supply, this was accompanied by a massive increase in labor supply of women. As you might know, Japan is one of the countries with larger differences, gender differences on the labor market. The growth of specific segments of services, for example, some low-skilled services like hotels and restaurants and all this type of sectors in which non-regular employment is very common and spread. The increase in uncertainty that triggered a wave of pessimism and caution by firms, and also from some technological evolutions that changed the nature of some types of jobs that are more compatible with non-regular contracts, so temporary contracts. I will try to describe quickly the theoretical framework. As I said, it's on the appendix of the paper and it's quite long, but I will try to give you an idea of what we had in mind. So basically, the literature on rent sharing is in the model of Blanchflower and others in 1996. We take it as a reference, in which the equilibrium wage is determined by a combination of different external and internal forces. So external forces, meaning external to the employer, are wages in other sectors, so the outside option of the worker, person's level of income or household level of income, and unemployment rate on the labor market. Internal forces are captured by profits per employee and a parameter that is proxying or measuring workers' relative bargaining power. What Esteban and Evelyn do is they start from a similar equation, and in a right to manage bargaining model, they derive an expression of the wage that is described by equation 2, in which wage is basically a weighted average between rent per worker and the outside option. And this gamma is the rent sharing parameter, which can vary from 0 to 1. And if it's 0, basically workers have no bargaining power and their wage is equal to the average market wage, Z. And if it's 1, the workers are appropriating all the rents. So rent sharing is all in the hands of the workers. And they show that in a right to manage model in which basically there is a two-step bargaining model. So wages, workers and firms first bargain over wage, and then in the second step, firms decide, the employer decides the level of employment given the wage that have been decided. So the rent sharing parameter is a function of the bargaining power of workers, this mu, which depends on institutional factors, the bargaining model, the centralized or decentralized or unions and so on, and two elasticities. The first is the elasticity of value added to employment, and the second is the elasticity of labor demand to contracted wage. So how firms, employers respond to a change in wages in terms of labor. What we do is that we introduce heterogeneity in the production function between regular and non-regular employment, and we derive in the first step expression for wages, which is similar to the one of Esteban and Tevlin, in which the wage of regular workers is determined by the rent per let's say rents, profits or value added per regular worker, and the reservation, or better, the outside option wage. And yeah, we, consistent with Esteban and Tevlin, we use, as we will see later, an expression of a measure of a metric of rents, which is value added, because it's probably a bit less endogenous and is more consistent with the model developed in the theory. And we treat labor costs for non-regular workers as an intermediate input. Since non-regular employment is purchased on the market at a very low price, so it's like at the market price. So it's like an intermediate input. So the pie to be divided is between the workers and the employer is the let's say amount of sales minus intermediate input and non-regular labor costs. So, and here is the core of our theoretical, let's say, conjecture, because as in Esteban and Tevlin, the rent sharing parameter has this expression. So it's a function again of mu, which is the bargaining power of workers, and if it increases, the rent sharing increases. But this effect is mediated by these other variables that include, as in Esteban and Tevlin, the elasticity of value added with respect to regular employment, which is this term here, but also the elasticity of demand for regular workers. So this epsilon, so, which means the responsiveness of, which is defined here, the responsiveness of employment, regular employment with respect to their wage. And this, as we see here, depends on a number of factors, which include, in the first instance, this 1 divided by 1 minus sigma, which is the elasticity of substitution between regular and non-regular workers. And this other theta parameter that is related to the share of non-regular workers. So basically, the model predicts that when the elasticity of substitution between regular and irregular workers is higher than 1 over 1 minus alpha, an increase in the share of non-regular workers, which corresponds to a decrease, considering this expression of theta, will increase the substitution, the substitutability, the elasticity of demand, the elasticity of demand for regular workers. So basically, what is the idea, the intuition, is that when it is possible and easy to replace regular and non-regular workers, and this might happen for technological reasons, for example, regular workers during their negotiations moderate their claims to revise wages upwards because they want to prioritize the protection of the existing pay, so the existing wage, and secure their job position. So knowing that they can be easily substituted with non-regular workers, they moderate their claims for a wage increase, so that firms will not react to the high wage set during negotiations with replacing them with non-regular workers. And this prediction and this model was also considerably driven by the evolution of the industrial relations in Japan in the last decades, in which, as you probably know, the industrial relations in Japan is a very decentralized model. So negotiations take place at firm level between firm level unions and the employer, very cooperative model, in which the negotiation was a mix of wage claims, especially on bonuses, and of level of employment. And in the last decades, the whole attention of unions, of firm level unions, which are representing only regular employees, were concentrated only on keeping the level of employment stable, so reducing very much the claims on the wage. And this is because basically they, knowing the sluggish economic growth and the tendency of large firms to replace irregular employment, either with some forms of capital or with non-regular employment, this triggered a moderation of their claims. So if we want to describe it with a well-known metaphor, which is in a completely different setting, basically regular workers are aware, in certain sectors, regular workers are aware that there is a reservation army of non-regular workers lining up at the door of the company, and they can easily be, in some cases, replaced by them. Empirical model. So also in the empirical model, we follow the literature. As I said, we used a very detailed industry level data, 85 industries, ranging from 1970 to 2012. And this is, maybe you know already, it's available online. Then through Kyoji, one of the co-authors, we could have access to other important data that are not available that you have to apply for their availability, but it's in principle open access. And so we have this model in which the wage is a function of rents per worker and of the outside option. Important to notice is that we don't have industry level data, but we have cells of average wages. So our dependent variable is the log hourly wage of regular workers in industry I, gender G, age group J, education K, and year T. So we have wage cells, okay, that are describing heterogeneity of wages across industries, time, gender, age, and education, okay? Then we have the rent measure per worker at industry level, so it's a nested empirical model. And as the outside option, we define this W with a line on it, which is the alternative wage that we proxy by the average log hourly wage of each gender, age, education, and year wage in macro sector M. So macro sector M is the Eurostat taxonomy based on different intensity of technology in manufacturing and knowledge in services. So the idea is that if you're a regular worker in a given industry with given characteristics, age, gender, and so on, your outside option is the average wage that you observe for the same segment of workers, so same age, same gender, same education, in sectors that have comparable levels of technology. So there is mobility across sectors with the same type with the same nature type of technology. There are, of course, some crucial econometric concerns. The first one is that since we are using 43 years, there might be no stationarities of the series and spurious correlation. And to address this issue, we run error correction models to check for the stability and for the robustness of the rent sharing parameter. And then there is an obvious issue of endogeneity of rents with respect to wages, because of course, if wages are increasing for whatever reason, this is affecting the size of rents. And to address this issue, we use an instrumental variable method, and we use as instruments that are valid and satisfy all the conditions. We use three instruments. The first one is a demand shifter, which again is something that we could construct thanks to the very interesting and high quality data set we used, because JIP data set is producing and supplying for each year for these 43 years and now until 2018 input-output tables for all industries. So based on this, we could identify, following the methodology proposed by Shia in '93 and also adopted by Esteban and Tevlin, exogenous variation in demand for goods in a given sector. So basically, through the input-output table, we see which other sector is demanding an important share of the sector of interest, and at the same time, this sector is not representing a high share of the costs of this sector. So we are sure that there is no circularity. So that is let's say, an exogenous shift of demand in a given sector that is demanding a lot of inputs from one sector is a good instrument for the value added of the sector we have in mind, and we describe this matching in the appendix again. Then we use an impact of regulatory barriers to competition. So this is the OECD indicator of regulatory impact. And the idea is that when in upstream industries providing inputs, there is a lot of regulation, rents are, for the industries using these inputs, rents are lower because part of the rents are appropriated by the input suppliers. And then we also use a likely level of the rent variable. This is not the end of the econometric concerns, because, as I said, we want to look at the impact of the share of non-regular employment on the rent sharing parameter, which means that if we go back to the baseline empirical model, we first want to estimate this gamma, and then we want to look at whether the share of non-regular employment is impacting this gamma, so is increasing or decreasing this gamma. So we need some kind of interaction effect between this variable and the share of non-regular employment. But the problem is that also non-regular employment could be endogenous to wages, in the sense that if wages of regular employment increase a lot, they are substituted by non-regular employment. So there might be a reverse causality issue. And to deal with this issue, which is quite important in our opinion, we first use a split sample analysis. So we basically divide our sample into industries with a high share of non-regular employment and low share of regular employment, and compare the rent sharing, the size of rent sharing in the different subsamples of industries with different non-regular employment shares. And then we also use, as a second option, a simultaneous equation system, in which we basically we estimate simultaneously three equations using basically an instrumental variable approach that produces, in order to produce consistent estimates, but also a generalized least square approach to account for the correlation structure of the disturbances across the equation. So what we basically do is that we estimate three equations, in which the first one is the wage equation, which includes the rent sharing parameter and the interaction between rents and share of non-regular employment, and of course the outside option. Then rents are instrumented using the instruments that I explained you before, and also the non-regular share of employment is a function of its lag and of the wage of regular workers. So as you see, some variables, as it happens in simultaneous equations system, some variables are both on the left and on the right side of other equations. And so there is here the non-regular share is an explanatory variable of the first equation and is the dependent variable of the third equation, and vice versa for the wage. And we add also some other variables, for example, the level of uncertainty in final demand of a given industry to explain the share of non-regular workers. The idea is, of course, that when there is more volatility in output, you tend to hire less on a regular basis because you want more flexibility with your of your workforce. So very quickly, some descriptive evidence just to show you how the wage curve flattened in Japan. This is hourly wage, real hourly wage for regular workers, exactly starting from the 90s, while the non-regular, and it's basically the hourly wage of non-regular workers is basically 1/3 of regular workers. The relative wage of regular versus non-regular workers declined starting from the 90s, and the share of hours worked on a non-regular basis, increased significantly. And if we look at wages of subgroups of age, education, and gender, we always see a flattening of the curve around the 90s. So quickly to our results. So this is the baseline model, fixed effect with the inclusion of the alternative wage, error correction model, and baseline instrumental variable. And we see that basically rent sharing in Japan is estimated, according to our estimates, at around 10%, which is significantly lower to what is estimated in the US by Esteban and Terlin, but on a much earlier period. And is higher than what is estimated for some recent, relatively recent works in Europe, for example, Italy and Germany, in which rent sharing is estimated between 5 and 7%. But we have also to underline that our estimate is based on a sort of hybrid industry level. We have cells, but still rents are on an industry level data. And the in a recent review card shows that all estimates at firm, so matching firms and employees, are much lower. The size of rent sharing is much lower. So we are also in an intermediate position between the existing estimates between at industry and at firm level. So this is the baseline. So around 10% of rent sharing. And if we look at subsamples of different types of workers, according to their characteristics, we saw very interesting, in our opinion, evidence that is corroborating our conjecture. So it's a preliminary supportive evidence, because we see that basically rent sharing is much higher for male workers than female workers, is significantly higher even if the differences are much less evident and large, is higher for older workers, and is higher for upper levels of education. And is also much higher, almost, you see, double, in the second part of the sample. So if we split the sample, first 2 decades and the second 2 decades, so around this beginning early 90s, in which we identify these changes that we are looking at, rent sharing basically halved. So from 15% to 7%. And all this evidence is basically corroborating the idea that we had in mind, so that the increase in irregular employment is affecting rent sharing capacity of regular workers, because it's clear that rent sharing is weaker for labor market segments in which non-regular employment is higher. So female workers, younger workers, lower education workers, in which non-regular employment rates are much higher, have lower rent sharing. And rent sharing is significantly lower after the 90s, after 1990, when non-regular employment increased very significantly. If we look at split sample analysis, so here you see 4 subsamples, 4 estimates for the quartiles of the distribution of industries according to non-regular employment shares. And you see that when Q1 is the 25% of sectors years in which non-regular employment is lower, and you see that rent sharing parameter estimated is almost 4 times higher than in the 4th quartile. So it declines when in sectors, in subsamples where the pervasiveness of non-regular employment is higher. And if we replicate this analysis for terciles and for quintiles, we realize that the differences between the lower and the upper tail of the distribution are even higher. And you see in the bottom diagrams, we also estimated not only different terciles, quintiles, or quartiles, but also for male and female workers. And what we see is that always rent sharing declines for upper parts of the distribution, but also declines even more for women, for which we observed the larger difference in terms of rent sharing across the across workers' characteristics. If we look at simultaneous equation systems, here you see the estimation of the 3 equations. So the first is the drivers of the rent sharing, and with the expected sign and significance of the instrumental variables. The second is the share of the drivers of the share of non-regular workers, and you see that basically there is a positive effect of uncertainty and a positive effect also of lag, so there is a persistence. And in the third, which is the rent sharing equation, you see that more or less the size of the rent sharing variable is confirmed around 10–11%, but the interaction term between the rent and the non-regular share is negative and significant. And the size of the coefficient indicates that each 1% increase in the share of non-regular workers decreases the rent sharing parameter by 0.15%, which means that compared to a sector in which there is no non-regular employment, a sector having 20% of regular employment, which is the average of our sample, rent sharing declines by basically 1/3. And we have then also replicated the analysis of simultaneous equation systems for all subsamples, and it's always confirmed that the size of the interaction term here, this interaction term, is larger. So the negative effect, the detrimental effect on rent sharing is larger for female workers, for younger cohorts, and for low educated workers. Just a few final remarks. So we think that we might have contributed to the debate on the sluggish economic growth in Japan and of the flattening of wage curves in Japan by adding some evidence on an additional channel, which is related to rent sharing. And this paper and this evidence is supporting this idea that rent sharing has not only declined over time compared to the first half of the sample, so the so-called golden age of Japan, while sliding into the lost decade, started at the beginning of the years 19 and the 90s. And rent sharing is remarkably lower for certain types of workers, women, young workers, and low educated. And we provide some evidence that there is an effect on regular employment by the share of non-regular, produced by the increase of non-regular employment. As we show that rent sharing capacity of regular workers declines when non-regular workers are more, non-regular employment is more pervasive. So they suffer in a way from the threat of being replaced. And this reverberates in their capacity to appropriate rents. Just to sketch out policy implications, one is to so-called getting Abenomics back on track. So first policy implication would be, and Japan is in the last months moving in this direction. So reinforcing the so-called equal pay for equal work program. So basically fighting discrimination based on contract. Okay, so if you have the same job, if you have the same characteristics, you cannot be hired on a temporary basis if there are no reasons to be, economic reasons to be hired on a temporary basis. And the second one is what has been also debated for a long time in Europe, is the introduction of these intermediate contracts. So these composite contracts that basically use temporary employment as a screening device, as a probation period, but then they should slide and be transformed, transformative contracts into regular employment. And this is, for example, what has been done in Italy recently, no? When, for example, has been reduced the number of times you can renew a temporary contract. Is going into this direction. Just to conclude, what we are doing now is to match employer-employee data in Japan. They have very beautiful data and something that is probably unique in the world. It's also unique, the effort you have to make to get access to this data. And you basically have to travel to Japan all the time, which is now from Europe not very easy because you cannot go over Russia, for example. So it's a much longer way. But and time is very limited, and the access is very limited and very controlled because they're very cautious. They also have some scandals related to some data they issued and that were then shown to be not correct. So they're as cautious as Japanese could be, but they're a very high potential. And this is a crucial step that we want to undertake because, of course, our empirical model rests on the idea that there is a negotiation going on at micro level, so between the company and the employer. So we need employer level data. I mean, industry level data can be a proxy, and if you assume that there is some that firms belonging to the same sector have something in common, then it's fine. If you make a step forward into heterogeneity of firms, then it's very questionable. So what we are doing now is to go into this matched employer-employee data, and we hope to have some results soon. Thank you for your attention. I don't know if I talked too much, probably yes, and I'm sorry for that. So I will be happy.
No, that's absolutely fine. Thank you, Cristiano. Questions? Yeah, Klaus?
Yeah, just some quick issues for my understanding. Now, who are these non-regular workers? What type of structure do they have? Is these particular females, young people, not in the union? That would be my first remark. You may have said something about that.
Yes. So shall I reply immediately? Probably yes. This is better.
Well, I can give you the context quickly with my next consequences of that. Now, when I was in the car living in Japan decades ago, it was clear that any female above 40 was out of the labor force. It was no longer employed, so to speak. So does this mean? Does this explain a bit if the group of non-regular workers are composed of lots of females? Does it help to explain your result? And the other issue is flexibility. Normally non-regular workers come with flexibility, yes, and companies might want more flexible workers than standard workers, yes. Unions so there should be higher profits in a way, yes, more to share. But in practice, there's less what is shared, I guess, yes. And that has to do with the strengths of the unions or what? These are my issues. Okay.
So what happened in the last decades in Japan is that female workers started to participate in the labor market, but they started to participate in the secondary segment of the labor market, okay. Even the college-educated ones. So college educated workers were basically the only niche in which the lifetime employment system survived until 10 years ago. And now this is also being affected. So new hirings of college educated workers are also on a temporary basis, especially women, and especially those of not high reputation university. So there is this clear segmentation. There is a very competitive labor market in which firms hire new college graduates, and then if you don't get immediately a permanent position, you are probably condemned to have a repetition of temporary jobs for your whole working life. And this is basically holding for the majority of women. If you, and this is something else that we are now doing, there is also young workers and low educated workers is another pool of workers in which non-regular employment is overrepresented, but it's also overrepresented among the very older workers, so over 60s, because it's too expensive for firms to keep them in employment. So what they do is they fire them, especially if they are eligible for retirement age, and they re-employ the same workers on a temporary basis so that they save money. And this is another big issue in Japan, because of course, the wage declines significantly, and there are a number of issues related to unions. Non-regular workers are allowed to be member of unions since 2015. Before that, they were not even allowed to become members of unions. So you understand that in this situation, when you negotiate with the employer, you only have in mind your, of course, affiliates, so only regular employment. And this is why basically they, in a very cooperative system, they manage to agree with employers simply to keep the level of employment relatively stable at the expenses of non-regular workers. So, and this is
a kind of insider-outsider approach, yes? Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
Thanks. That's very interesting.
Cynthia?
Very interesting system, I have to say. And yeah, sorry, if I can add something, because I was recently in Japan, and this is something that we, so this system of negotiations so workers and unions accept a high mobility of workers within companies of the same group of the mother company, and also within the company for different jobs. So what has been going on in Japan in the last decades is that, and what was typical of the lifetime employment system, is that if you are employed on a permanent basis, you will be asked to move to another company of the same group during your working life, or to do a job that is different from the job you're being hired. And this is functional, first of all, that you understand how the whole company as a system works. And second, that if there is a crisis of the company, for example, because you outsource a certain type of a certain part of the production process, they don't have to fire you, but they can simply move you to another part of the company, which is also, I mean, for us European, very, very important, no? Because we always tend to think in terms of specialization into one job and seniority into one job. But this is shaping a seniority into the company and a flexibility within the company. So agreeing to be flexible within the company in order not to risk to be fired in the case of a crisis. Of course, only for temporary, for regular employees.
Yeah.
Hi. Thanks a lot, Cristiano. Very interesting paper. So my first question was essentially anticipated by Klaus, because, you know, my first thought was, who are these, you know, no regular workers? And the first thing that came to my mind was, you know, young people, perhaps not very skilled, but, you know, you answered already the question. And then a couple of small questions. One is how do you define uncertainty? And so if I understood it correctly, these capture uncertainty in, you know, in the general labor market. The second point was about the share of this non-regular worker, which, you know, we have a chart there. I can see, I mean, clear there has been an increase in following the financial crisis. So, but I cannot picture exactly, is it around 8 to 18%, something like that? So it's, you know, less than a third or something. And also, again, I don't know Japan, I don't know much of, you know, the structure of the industry, but is there any cluster in terms of geographical? It's just a curiosity, really, in terms of geographical distribution. So because, again, maybe these non-regular workers might tend to go and be hired in regions when there is, which are kind of more rural or less industrialized. And so there is a kind of concentration there. So those are the questions. Thanks.
Okay. So yeah, the definition of uncertainty is the variability. So it's a standard deviation of output of a given sector in the past 5 years. So we define in terms of gross output. So let's say aggregate demand for a specific sector. The second is related to the extent of non-regular employment. So I'm now checking the average is over the whole period is around 10%.
10.
In most recent periods after the 90s is going to 20%, but there is a lot of variability within sectors. So in some sectors you have 60, 70, 80%. So for example, the industry breakdown is very detailed. So for example, in hotels and restaurants or eating and drinking places as they are defined, or in these personal services industries, the rate is like 80%. So they're almost all temporary employees. So as far as as the regional distribution of this employment, it reflects the distribution of sectors, so the sectoral composition. And there is a section of the JIP dataset which is a regional sector, but the industry detail is much lower. So they have 25 sectors. So,
I see.
and it's much shorter. So we could not go into this because we would not have had the change, observe the change over decades. But it's a very interesting topic, and probably we can go into some detail when we use firm level data, because there we have more information also about the location.
Yeah, thank you very much. And also with the firm level data, and if you have also probably you do employees information, you can track and you can see when the transition from non regular to regular workers, right?
No,
so that is
no, unfortunately we don't have a panel for workers.
Oh, right, okay.
We have a panel for companies, but we will not be able to observe.
Okay, but thank you very much. Thank you.
Ira and then Sergio.
Yeah, Cristiano, very nice, very nice. One comment and two related questions, which you I think partially answered. So my one somewhat irrelevant comment is it sounds an awful like this, what's been going on in U.S. academics for the past 3 decades. The questions are this: did you look at groups of industries that are like related and sub, and then compare them? Which ones had rents and which didn't? And then my second question is, can I interpret, if you had no rent seeking, does that mean these are competitive labor markets across the board? Okay, because I'd like to do that.
Yeah, so we did not group industries, but we have a kind of sister paper, which is published on the Review of Income and Wealth last year, which is about labor share in Japanese, again at industry level, and we show that there we group sectors according to technology intensity and knowledge intensity, and we relate technology and knowledge intensity to, again, the share of non-regular employment, and there is a clear pattern that less technology intensive and less knowledge intensive services have experienced the higher, the stronger decline in the labor share. So we did not go into this with this paper, but we did it for the labor share of income. As regards the second question, I think it's worth that you go in this direction, because I think it's very likely that this is the case. Yeah.
Sergio?
Thank you, Cristiano. Excellent paper, very nice topic. I had just some questions. The first one was partially anticipated by Klaus. Do you have any information about the density, the union density, other than union presence? I mean, I was thinking to the Italian structure with, let's say, the first level bargaining sector, the second level bargaining sector. So maybe I have in mind some European country. The second question is, did you try some, let's say, robustness with the weekly wage or monthly wage, because there may be some issue with the number of hours worked in the Japan structure. Third, is it your wage? Is it gross wage, right? Not the net wage. Okay. And also, do you have any? Did you find any difference between, let's say, small or big firms, or let's say young firms with respect to the old firms, so with the startups and so on? Also, do you have any information about the migrants, the presence of migrants within firms? And the last one, do you have any information about the management of the enterprises? So is there any difference between, let's say, firms with the external management with respect to firms with internal management, with educated management with respect to the non-educated management, manager or women manager, and so on? Just some question. Thank you.
Thank you, Sergio. So related to, with reference to unions, we control for union density, but this is the only information we have of unions, which is probably the most important one, because as I said, the model is very decentralized. So you have labor unions at a centralized level that are providing only an umbrella organization, and then they basically at firm level negotiation, they can change everything. So it's probably the most relevant is only the strength is the union density is a good proxy. And I was very surprised, as I said, that they provide union density for 43 years for 108 sectors. So it's very detailed data, and I think thinking in more broadly, this could be also, I think, a very good instrument for other types of analysis for other countries. So, and we are controlling for the average worker in the sector, in the estimates. But as you said, so the information we have is only at sector level, for which we have the hours worked, total hours worked, and we have the number of workers. So what we can do is only to use either one or the other, or to divide the salary. So we did not try, but we are controlling for the number of workers and the total number of hours worked. Related to your other questions to management or information about migrants and firms heterogeneity, unfortunately, we only have sector level data, and it's quite difficult and challenging to introduce additional industry level variables to a model which is nested of cells, of wage cells, and we have a main variable of interest, which is the rent variable. And then if you keep on, and we have then, of course, cell fixed effects, so that are controlling for the common shocks to the, including the sector in which you are employed. But this is the plan for the last, for the next step. So to go into firm level data, and firm level data, they have very beautiful data with all information about all types of characteristics that you mentioned, including a huge variety of information about capital. So one idea is to look at the effect of intangible capital, because they have very rich information on this and different types of capital, and all information about management, internationalization, everything. So this is the next step.
Gaia, sorry, it can't be too many questions. We just have a couple of minutes. So if you have like one of the main, because you said you have several questions, if you could ask maybe one of the main questions, then we'll stop after that.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for giving me a chance. I would also thank you, Professor Cristiano, for your very effective work. Having said that, there are some questions that I have in my mind. One is about the productivity and the wage rate of Japan, comparing with other countries. Why it is different from that of United States, Germany, as well as other countries in Europe? Because those countries, wage rates, the trend of wage rate as well as productivity increases, while Japan is different. This is one key point what I want to know. The other point is about
let's see if we can address that question, and then maybe other questions you can email.
Okay.
Email Cristiano.
Okay, thank you.
So there is a, as you see from this slide, there is really a very, very heated debate on the reasons of the let's say stagnation of wages in Japan. One is related to the labor market. and many explanations converge to the labor market, including the increase of non-regular employment, the crisis of lifetime employment system. So it's a crisis on the labor market that is reverberating on internal demand, and this is reverberating on uncertainty. So it's a sort of circularity from which Japan didn't manage to escape. So wage moderation, moderation of aggregate demand, wage stagnation, and so on. So Japan, as you may know, it's a very specific country in many regards. So institutionally, also politically, so the explanations are very different. In the paper, we somehow look at this, at the main explanations. I can probably send you the paper because it is now, to summarize this debate is really very challenging. But it's a convergence of many different factors that are shaping this thing that is happening since at least almost 30 years.
Okay. Cristiano, I had a couple of questions, but I won't ask you. One was about your instrument, the first instrument, but we can talk at some other point. It's just past 2 o'clock, my 2 o'clock, so I think it's time to stop. Thank you so much for a very interesting presentation, for a very interesting paper. Congratulations again for the acceptance in Economica. So that's a great outlet. So thank you very much, and thank you all for contributing. And we'll see you next month. Bye bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all, and I hope to see some of you again in Perugia.
Absolutely.
If you manage to come, you're welcome, all of you. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye, everybody.